Well, looks like we have people here, so let's get started. So happy to see you all today. Hope you are all doing well. My name is Drake Powe. Welcome to the Lake Harriet Spiritual Community. It's such an extraordinary opportunity to have these moments of coming together in support, mutual support, and community. So I'm going to ring the bell as I usually do. I'm going to ask you to listen carefully. So here we go. I'm going to ask you to take a nice deep breath in and a big sigh. Make that magnificent sigh, release it. We want to understand that we need to find our voice in order to find our way. So again, my name is Drake, and I'm so happy to see you today. And I want to talk. Many of us have met before, and I want to talk about what I find some elements that I find interesting. And one of those is do you really want what you want? Do you want what you want? I know it sounds like an odd question, but I feel like it's an important one. How do you really know that you want what you want? How do you know that what you want is actually what you need? How does that come about? It seems like something that we should all take a moment to look at. What we want is desire. Desire is wanting. When we go back into elements like Buddhism, they tell us that desire is the seed of all suffering. Now, there was a certain point in my life, I'm 57 years old, I started practicing when I was 11 years old. There was a certain point in my life where that was a very confusing element, because on one side, I was learning that desire is the seed of suffering. And on the other side, through elements of manifestation practice from people like Napoleon Hill or Shakti Gawan or many, many, many others, I was learning that manifestation practice meant developing a burning desire. So how do both those things work in the same place? How do you know that the desire you have, what you want, is actually going to work for you? I feel that desire is often the sense of lack, of not having enough, right? This is often what we think of when we are trying to fulfill desire. We have something that we feel our life is missing that will somehow fulfill us. And to me, that's not the desire that really is where we're looking for. To me, it's really important to recognize that we are whole just as we are. It doesn't mean that we don't have desires that are the progression of that wholeness, but it's not a question of not being whole in order to find that desire. To me, when we are focused in desire in that way, what we're really talking about is compulsion. Compulsion is a focus on what you want. We have all kinds of different compulsions. We have addictive patterns. Addictive patterns are another expressions of compulsion. We have addictive patterns to elements like alcohol or drugs. We can have addictive patterns around sexuality. We can have even addictive patterns in terms of how we move through the world. Like moving through the world as a very angry person, that can be an addictive pattern. So my statement is that we have to acknowledge the root of it. When we acknowledge the root of it, we find that compulsion is actually a relationship to what you don't want. Compulsion is the opposite of freedom. When you have freedom, you are not involved with compulsion. I think it's really an important thing for us to recognize during this time. We are dealing with a tremendous amount of compulsion around us. You can tell when someone is involved with compulsion when they have that relationship to what I call fear masquerading as faith. Fear masquerading as faith. If you have someone who's truly in faith, who's truly confident, they don't need to tell you every single time you see them to try to convince you, because they know that they have that confidence. They have an easiness. There's a relaxed element to it. When you have someone caught up in fear masquerading as faith, they have a compulsive need to talk to you. They want to tell you about their political beliefs every single time they see you. Well, we've already had this conversation 20 other times, so I probably don't need to hear it again. But when someone is involved with that level of compulsion, you aren't really the person that is the concern. The concern is the fear that they have on a deep level that what they want to see won't come about. So compulsive behavior is that relationship to what we want and what we think we want. I think it's really important for us to understand that our thought process is not our friend. Your thought process is not your friend. Your thought process is a conditioned response. So we are conditioned. Which is a compulsive element. Society has conditioned us in a very compulsive way. Even our families, even our friends, even people that we might think of as our enemies are all working to have a compulsive relationship to conditioning our own individual consciousness. So how do we find out what we really want? You know, I think it's very interesting, but because it really relates to the yin and yang symbol to me. You know, in Taoism, we have the yin and yang symbol, you know, that circle with the swirl going in a direction. One swirl is the yin and the other swirl is the yang. Each of them has a dot of the other involved. The yin has a little bit of the yang, and the yang has a little bit of the yin. Yang energy is that male energy. And I'm not talking about it in a negative way. I'm just talking about that male energy, that sense of going out. Yin energy, the feminine energy, is much more in contact with reception and the intuitive relationship of our psyches. Whether we're men or women, we can get caught up in that relationship to unhealthy yang behavior. Even yin energy can become unhealthy when it becomes compulsive. You know, so either one of them, whether it be through force, in which we try to be compulsive and try to force others to do what we think, or through yin, where we begin to try to manipulate other people in that kind of element to unhealthy relationship to unhealthy patterns. So both the yin and the yang have unhealthy elements, and they're related to each other. They're related to the fear that if things don't go the way that we think, that somehow it's not what we want. We can't be happy with the way it is. So we have that circle of the yin and yang, right? The circle combines the yin and the yang. Neither one of them are positive or negative in and of themselves, unless we become fear-based. If we become fear-based, we have this compulsive need to project and force other people through whatever means, through outer force or through manipulation. We have this energy to try to manipulate our surroundings. Even if we're being victimized, we can fall into that. You know, I had a period of my life in which I was really being acted on with great force. And so many times what would happen for me is I would sort of try to feel as bad as I possibly could so I would not get punished so severely. This was a compulsiveness. And so what ends up happening is at a certain point, we begin a self-conditioning. We begin to try to condition ourselves to get what we want. We become compulsive. If you have a compulsive relationship, that is not freedom. You don't choose to do something through compulsiveness. That is automatically a binding. So my point is that even if we have some belief that we become compulsive about that is actually what we do want, maybe we want to see something in the world go the way that we think it should go. If we begin to use compulsive means, the compulsive is always related to egocentricity. The ego is a sense of self versus other. If you get rooted in your ego, you will automatically create a resistance in other egos. The person that you hate begins often to hate you. It becomes self versus other. We are not compulsive with wholeness. Compulsive is a means of trying to activate a force, whether it be a physical force or manipulation. So we want to understand that if we're trying to force other people to do what we think that they should do, what's really going to be more likely is we're going to create an antagonism, a response. You can't activate love through hatred. It's just an impossibility. So I'm just really wanting to encourage us to understand that if you are compulsive, it's usually going to be on a fear-based element. And even if it's about something good, you are finding fear in relation to what is good. Even if you're trying to work for justice in the world, if you do it in a fear-based way, you can actually create a conflict that is not necessarily effective. And so to me, this is an important element in our time, and for us to recognize, if we want to step out of that, if we want to step out of compulsive behavior, we have to become extremely clear as to what we value. If you are valuing kindness, and these are my central values: kindness, compassion, joy, and positive indifference, you won't have as much need to be compulsive. Kindness. If we are treating, the world with kindness, kind with the root being in kin. Kin is the root of kindness, treating each other as family. If we are in that wholeness, we don't have to demonize the other. There's always a relationship in compulsiveness to a demonization. Something is extremely bad. That's why we have to use force to change it. Compassion. If we are rooted in compassion, we understand that compulsive force is always damaging to the person that we're attempting to force, even if that person is ourselves. Joy. Joy is a sense of being on mission. It's beyond happiness. So if we are training and conditioning ourselves, and this is what, in my mind, that we need to do, is we need to have an active conditioning where we realize that what we're doing with our thought process is a form of manifestation. What you think with intensity becomes your perceived reality. So if we activate our thought process to what we truly value, then we begin to relax more, because the things that we truly value are elements that are not involved with forcing other people to do things. So I'm asking you to consider on a daily basis, really making what you're about being what you really are about, what you really want. Make what you really want what you are really about. Compassion. Compassion is when we can really feel what other people are feeling. Have you noticed how much compassion seems to have dropped in our modern society? Yes. So in order for us to promote that, we have to be in that, working towards compassion. Compassion is more than empathy. Empathy is when we can feel as the other person feels, but compassion is bigger than that. Compassion is that powerful yin energy. The compassionate mother. To me, the symbol of the compassionate mother is one of the ultimate symbols of the warrior nature. And I'm not talking about warrior in terms of forcing others to be what we think, but the warrior who is able to see elements as they are and accept them as they are, and then go from there. So we begin to de-escalate the need for compulsive behavior, and we begin to recognize more and more where it's available and where it's happening in our lives. Compulsion is when you can't resist doing what you feel like you need to do. It's not a choice. Compulsion, we can have compulsion around healthy eating. We can have compulsion around any sort of activity. The ego can use whatever positive element there is and shape it until it becomes a compulsiveness. So, this is extremely important that we begin to recognize when we are acting in a compulsive way. The book Enlightened Courage, I'll just show you this book real briefly. Enlightened Courage, which is about the 7-point mind training. What it tells us is that in being caught up with being so caught up in our opinions that we end up actually blocking the actualization of the fulfillment of what we find to be really good. By being so focused on the opinions of other people, we automatically begin to shift towards a compulsiveness. I was thinking about this recently and really finding just a real power, because I could see so many people who seem to not be able to resist doing things just a short time ago that I would never have seen as patterns in their behavior. So I was thinking about this in the Course in Miracles. The Course in Miracles, I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with the Course in Miracles. The Course in Miracles is a form of Christian mysticism. And so I just opened the book up because I was thinking about this element of compassion. And this is the line that I came across. The very first page, I just put my finger down, and this was it. When you are tempted, hasten to proclaim your freedom from temptation. When you are tempted, hasten to proclaim your freedom from temptation. Temptation is a form of compulsion. It's a synonym for compulsion. When we are tempted, that means that we lose sight of what is most valuable to us and devote ourselves to something that we really have a far less degree of value. You know, it's like the compulsion of a drug addicted person who may steal from their family. They truly value their family greater than all. So temptation and compulsion are very closely related to what I'm describing. So when you are tempted, hasten to proclaim your freedom from temptation. The antidote, and then this is what enlightened courage teaches us, is to take an antidote when you take poison. Compulsion is a form of poison. When we imbibe that compulsion, when we start being titillated by our fears, when we start, being obsessive about our fears, we end up stepping into the temptation of feeling justified in treating people poorly. So it tells us to proclaim our freedom from temptation. And the antidote, it says, is to say this statement. I'm going to repeat it a couple times. This thought I do not want, I choose instead blank. This thought I do not want, I choose instead blank. I'm going to say it again. This thought I do not want, I choose instead blank. So in Tibetan Buddhism, which is where the 7-point mind training comes, and that's this book, Enlightened Courage. In Tibetan Buddhism, it tells us to train ourselves with maxims. Train yourselves with maxims. Maxims are statements of truth. Usually they're in the form of affirmations. Usually a maxim is saying something affirmative. A maxim can also be a negation when you say something negative, and so one of the things that we want to do is begin to use our words, which are both a means of projecting a manifestation and a form of conditioning of ourselves. We have to understand that we condition ourselves with what we say. What you say with conviction becomes your reality. It becomes your reality in the sense that that's what you're trying to make happen. When you hear people saying what they're not necessarily saying it because they think it's true. They're saying it because they want it to be true. Okay, so we want to understand the power of words. We are magicians. So what you speak into the world becomes truth. So be very careful about what you're speaking into the world. What you speak into the world can be an assault. You wouldn't just go up to someone and smack them, probably. So we have to be aware that what we're projecting in the world has that power. And understanding that if we begin to think that being verbally aggressive is the most important thing, what we fail to realize is that while we're being verbally aggressive with the other, we are also conditioning the self, the perceived self. And so what we're doing with this phrase, I'm going to read it one more time. This thought I do not want. So right at that point, when you have that conditioned mind pop up, that mind that feels, where you feel like your mind is hot and you find yourself making a gesture to someone on the road or whatever, as soon as possible, this thought I do not want, I choose instead blank. This thought about hatred, I do not want, I choose instead peace. This thought I do not want, I choose instead love. This thought I do not want, I choose instead a sense of optimism that things are getting better. In the 7-point mind training, it tells us that we have to begin the training with the preliminaries. We have to begin it with ourselves. If we are finding ourselves in the world that we don't want to be in, this is telling us that we need to work with our own heart. and not through a negative sort of compulsiveness, but by stating with conviction what you really value. If you are focused in anger through most of your day, and don't get me wrong, I have seen what has been going on, what we all see. You know, so many of the inappropriate elements around race and so many different other areas. But, you know, to me, when you see someone trying to be compulsive, trying to force you, I'm asking you to be aware that this is actually a statement to balance the inner and the outer world. Balancing the inner and the outer world means coming into the state that can change the outer world. That means being in peace, directing towards calm. Our deepest self is at peace. So let's do just a little bit of practice that can support us in connecting with what we really want. So the very first thing I'm going to ask you to do is just sit up tall. You can have your eyes either open or closed. Now, slowing your breathing down, I'm asking you to step into immersive practice. By slowing your breathing down, you begin to shift your attention from the outer world to the inner world. Breathing slowly and easily. This is the de-escalation template. Drop awareness into the hara, an inch below the navel and a half an inch in. Slowing the breathing down. Awareness in the lower abdomen. Now notice details. Be aware of the breath. We are trained to give and take alternately, breathing in and exhaling. Breathing slowly and easily. Awareness in the breath. Dropping awareness into the hara, noticing peripheral details. Be aware of the temperature of the breath. And in your heart, just make contact with that phrase, I am. Breathing slowly, dropping the awareness into the hara, noticing if there's any sounds in the house that you're in, and saying the phrase, I am. Let's do it one more time. Slow the breath. Dropping awareness in the hara, an inch below the navel and a half an inch in. And just notice details. Be aware if you have socks or shoes on. And make contact with that phrase, I am. Let's take a deep breath in. And an easy sigh. Let the breathing come back to normal. Eyes opening. Now, anytime you've done a practice, right in the aftermath of the practice, I would suggest that you pay attention to the echo, that feeling. Notice how you're feeling right now. Breathing slowly and easily, just being aware. What you end up finding is that by becoming calmer, you lose some of that compulsive nature. Compulsiveness always has a little bit of a mania to it. When we become calm, we step off of that treadmill and we're able to observe things a little bit more as they are. So I want to ask you all, a question, if anyone would be interested in sharing. What is your sense of compulsiveness? Can you feel the difference between compulsiveness and intuition? Does that make sense? Does this question make sense to anyone? So if you wouldn't mind, you can either do it with your screen, with your camera off, or you can turn your camera on and turn on your microphone. What is the difference between feeling compulsive and feeling intuition? Can anyone answer that question and tell us how just that brief little meditation went for you? Melissa, how about yourself? Would you mind sharing with us? What is the difference in your mind between compulsiveness and intuition? Does this question make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think intuition is more grounded, where compulsion has a sort of anxiety attached to it.
Yes, I love it. I love it. And how did that brief exercise go? Were you able to feel any positive effect with that, or a negative effect for that matter?
Yeah, I definitely felt just a little bit more slowed down.
Beautiful. I love it. And so these are some of the things that we find out. We find out that if we want to speed up change, we need to slow down. And I'm not talking about slowing down the work we do in the outer world, but slowing down some of that connection to some of the anxiety with feeling like a compulsiveness, right? And so, what we end up finding in that there's a difference between the listening mind and the talking mind, the mind that's projecting. Now, they both have elements of the self involved. But if you want to be in contact with your intuition, you have to be in contact with your listening mind. The true listening mind is able to pay attention to subtlety in the midst of intensity. When you can pay attention to subtlety in the midst of intensity, when you can feel subtle emotions in the midst of the most intense emotions, you can step out of the compulsiveness. Because that compulsive pattern is always combined with an intensity. It's like a person who has an obsessiveness. They can become panicked if they're not able to activate that element. And so by starting with ourselves, by learning how to calm down, and by learning how to realize that on your deepest level, you're already calm, we can make all the difference in the world. Thank you so much, Melissa. Can I ask someone else to tell us their sense of that relationship between intuition and compulsiveness? And does it make sense that intuition is more related to deep listening rather than projecting your opinion? Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add around that? How about yourself, Deb? Do you have anything that you might have around that? Do you have a sense of the difference between being in contact with your intuition and that being in contact with opinion? Does that make sense, the difference between those?
Yeah, I think so. I think for me, the compulsion, I mean, I have a problem with compulsion eating. And so I'm just wondering, just right before I let's say eat later on in the evening, that maybe if I do that little meditation that you have talked about, that would help me.
Yes. So we want to understand that we are actually in charge. The compulsiveness is not. And so the best time for us to create that relationship is not when we are right in the midst of trying to resist the desire to eat or whatever that compulsiveness is, but the spaces in between.
Okay.
Miles Davis said that the key to music is the space in between the notes. And we tend to think of it as that moment when we're trying to resist whatever level of the temptation it is. So again, and by the way, you when you start becoming more in contact with your intuition, you start also finding more ability to resist the temptation. And again, part of it is not shaming ourselves. So we may have an element like eating or whatever it might be, because compulsion always carries some relationship to shame in it. We feel ashamed when we aren't able to resist what we feel compelled to do.
True.
Yeah,
I would agree with that statement.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is part of it is we have to understand even these compulsive desires are happening for us and not to us. It's a process of us coming to understand ourselves, even though we may have like what I'm saying for me, one of the most compulsive elements for me is poor self-esteem. One of the most compulsive elements for me is a tendency to fall into self-hatred. And that was conditioned into me by the society that I was growing up in. And that can find itself expressed in overeating, in indiscriminate sexuality, in gambling. So one of the things, Deb, I want to suggest to you is to be aware of that statement. And again, it's a maxim, no shame, no guilt, no judgment. And by the way, in my mind, in my practice, the best way to use maxims is to say it 3 times and say it like you mean it. It's like you got to pretend like you're on the Broadway stage. This is your big opportunity. If you say this line in a way that sounds like you mean it, you're going to get the job. I will, no shame, no guilt, no judgment. No shame, no guilt, no judgment. No shame, no guilt, no judgment. By mixing it up, again, we always want to understand that we're talking to our deep consciousness, and it may have the compulsiveness related to an activity, but on some level, it's usually related to a feeling. And and how do we try to get ourselves to do something? Like we want to eat less, and so we try to shame ourselves into eating less, or we attempt to guilt ourselves into eating less. But I just really want to suggest, and again, knowing the difference between shame and guilt, I think is also important. Shame is a state of being. Shame is like my cat one time that got a plastic bag on its head and was trying to run away from it. Shame goes wherever you go. It's like the scarlet letter. It's a stain. Guilt is an action. So what happens is we don't just talk about what people do. We're actually talking about them. And so we want to understand that when we use judgment, we're actually connecting to our own shame. Now, I'm not, again, suggesting we have to find ways of setting limits. I feel like it's also kind of important that to understand that when we are in this relationship, there's a coercion involved. When someone is trying to activate that relationship, what they're doing is they're trying to force you to do what they want you to do. And we try to force ourselves. It's a form of bullying. And a bully is never going to stop. You can keep giving into a bully and they'll keep pushing you further and further and further. So does that make sense at all, Deb? Does that connect at all with what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I like that bully, because it's like it's just this compulsion, in the evening, that once I kind of got my mind set on eating something, it's like I have to have it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just keep eating until and then I feel guilty.
Yes, and by the way, you say that very, very eloquently, and you say it with conviction. If you were on stage and you said what you just said, I would believe you. Okay, so what I'm saying is the point of power is always in the present. And our language is one of the most powerful. That's what language is. Language is magic. When you say that, I just want to encourage you to always give yourself an out, even when you're describing it. Because like when you described it that if I'm eating, I have to do this.
Right.
I'm asking you to describe it actually more accurately. When I have that pattern that I fall into or have fallen into traditionally in compulsive eating, I feel like I have to do this. So you're actually saying exactly the same thing, but you're giving yourself some wiggle room, because it's really important to remember that the number one person that anyone is talking to is always themselves. So if I'm telling you about my political beliefs, I may be trying to convince you, but I'm trying to reconvince myself, especially when there's an indication that I may not be accurate. So thank you so much, Deb.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we get a couple more people to weigh in, and then we'll do some more practice? Can we get a couple more people? I'll either ask, and by the way, one of the things I want to suggest is being aware of touching your edge without bursting through it. Touch your edge without bursting through it. So we compulsively want to accomplish something. And so we push ourselves way harder than we're actually ready for. When someone's compulsive, they're not high on listening. So if we get compulsive, that's the mind that's projecting. This is what I think I want. And we try to force it on the body has no opinion. The body is completely neutral, right? And so, you know, what I'm suggesting is that we have to find a way to relax into that cosmic what is. And we do that by realizing that everyone has an edge. It's not what you want it to be, it's what it is. And we have to recognize if we force ourselves past the edge, we have contraction, we hurt ourselves. If we don't touch our edge, we also have contraction because we lose capability. It's like someone who sits around too much and finally that's all they can do. So if it's within your edge, I'm asking you to support us. When we are feeling vulnerable and the bully keeps pushing, what can we do? When we are feeling vulnerable and the bully keeps pushing, what can we do? We had that question. So one of the things that it says in this book, Enlightened Courage, this is one of my favorite books, I keep bringing it up, and I don't know if you figured this out, but I have an issue with books and maybe need some intervention with that. But it says to treat everything as a dream. Recognize that when you're having a nightmare, the difference between a dream and a nightmare is the dream, you want to be having it. A nightmare, you want to be out of it. But you are still the center of the dream, even when you're having a nightmare. If the boogeyman is chasing you and the boogeyman is the bully, we have to actually recognize that the dream revolves around us. Even if you're in a dream and the whole world is crazy with people being disrespectful around you, what kind of dream would that be like? Okay, even if you're in that dream, recognizing that you are at the center of the dream and therefore you have power in the dream. You know, I use this analogy often. By the way, soon we're going to be experiencing parties again. You guys remember parties? Right? Okay, in case any of you forgot, parties is when you get together with people you love and you hang out and enjoy each other's company. Say you're in a party and again, I've used this analogy in the past, you probably heard it. If you're in a party and you're talking to someone and you're having a heated argument, they're trying to compulsively get you to believe what they believe. And so they won't stop. They insist. And you become angry. When you become angry, what ends up happening is it's kind of like sitting on your couch and having someone having dropped a cigarette in the couch earlier in the evening. Suddenly, if that couch bursts into fire, regardless of what your conversation is about, your number one priority is not the conversation any longer. It's getting away from that fire and putting the fire out. This is what happens when you have someone who's caught up in their compulsive behaviors. It tends to wake up your compulsive behaviors, right? If you have someone who comes at you really, really angry, they may come at you really, really angry. Maybe they're of a different gender, and maybe you have issues with that gender, and maybe they're of a different gender and race. They come at you in a way that's about race, and maybe you have an issue around gender. You're going to find yourself charged about gender while they're charged about race, right? And so we have to understand that the number one priority, and by the way, I really, really suggest we use the de-escalation template at the beginning. It's important that you learn how to calm yourself in the midst of conflict. So the fire goes off. Now it's not about the bully over here, it's about the bully over here. The bully over here is the issue I have with anger and the issue I have with feeling insecure about being angry. So now what we need to do is shift and make this the priority and understand that I need to activate the de-escalation template. And by doing that, I'll find that I have the ability. Your emotions are not more powerful than you are. Your emotions are related to the conditioned response. Your thoughts and your emotions work together to create a compulsiveness that you feel that you can't resist. I used to have issues. I want to reframe that. And by the way, reframing is incredibly big power. And you will often hear me reframe what I'm saying in real time, because I understand that what I'm trying to say, what I aspire to say, is more about me understanding myself than trying to get you to understand. So, you know, when I'm in that relationship, I work to develop a different relationship with my emotions. When I used to have incredible experiences with fear, I used to have night terrors. I'd wake up screaming. It's very embarrassing, you know, when you visit someone and you wake up screaming and everyone in the house is surrounding the bed. That's an embarrassing moment, right? I had this compulsiveness. I became afraid of being afraid. So that became the bully. It might have been the person who was chasing me, but my real fear was of fear. By learning how to interrupt that pattern, interrupt that dance, by learning how to do practice in real time, I learned how to take the fangs out of the bully. We have to understand that our real bully is our relationship with our emotions. And part of us wants to be bullied by our emotions. When you have a big history with fear, fear has some means of making you feel that it's valuable to you, even though it's trapping you. So I hope that answered that question. Does anyone have any, I'd like to get at least one more statement or question before we do just a little bit more practice. Does anyone have a question or statement about the conversation that we're engaged in?
Hi, this is Sherry.
Hi, Sherry.
I'll add one. I really liked what you were saying about that, especially what you added just recently about the about the fear. But I wanted to go back to what you were talking about with Deb, with the eating in the evening. One of the techniques that works for me, kind of based on what you were saying about the calming yourself down, meditating a little bit. And then what I do is I try to have some goals for myself. So one goal is either I want to get a good night's sleep. So then instead of eating, I'll tell myself, well, you will sleep better if you have a little bit of protein and some good night tea. And I'll see, is that the direction I need to go right now? The other one is, my goal is I want to get in better shape. So instead of eating, doing some yoga for even as little as 10 minutes. You know, sometimes I'll do an hour, but you know, if I just need to break that pattern of like that chocolate is calling me and I won't sleep well if I eat that chocolate or that dessert or whatever, that bully that's sitting there that's, you know, calling my name, I want to eat that. I'm like, would you feel better if you know, thought you had this life coach that says, yeah, just do 10 minutes of yoga and then see how far you can go with that.
So
go
ahead.
And then sometimes I'll just say, well, if it's not that, if you're just too tired to exercise, is there something you can do sitting down, like reading a book, or I crochet? And I'll say, well, that would be nice, because then I feel a little sense of accomplishment. Like if I've read 10 pages or 30 pages or done a little crocheting, then you get a little dopamine from accomplishing something. So I pick from those three and I tell myself, okay, which one of these goals are you going to try to shoot for instead of, you know, so I can ignore that food bully.
So there's a lot to unpack there, because you said a lot in that time, a lot of valuable stuff. And so some of the things I want to highlight. Number one, using affirmations. Be sure to understand that affirmations are not a statement about where you're at. They're a statement about where you want to go. So a lot of times people have trouble with affirmations because it feels phony to them. Like, I don't feel that way, you know, but if we remember that, you know, like if you're a magician and you want to create a pink elephant, it's not like there's a pink elephant already in the room. When you say the magical formula, that's what creates the pink elephant. And so making sure that you are using affirmations in that positive sense of expectation, understand some of the underlying elements of having a compulsion is sometimes feeling like you can't handle elements that are going on in life, like you need some distance. And this compulsion is part of the way that we can find some relief from worries that we might have. So, you know, part of it is understanding that maybe a way out of the compulsion is to recognize that maybe you can accomplish that distance in a way that has you more available rather than less available. You know, detachment is not the same as what's the word when you become numb, right? Numbing yourself is not the same as having distance and feeling like you have space. So one of the things I suggest people do is write down a list of 10 state changers. 10 state changers. Your state is your current state that you perceive yourself to be. It's important to remember that you're going to try to maintain your sense of self. Even if you're miserable, the ego sees itself. Bob Marley said, every need has an ego to feed. Every need has an ego to feed. An ego identifies itself. And even if you identify yourself as miserable, some part of you is going to try to maintain it. So we can find other means that give us some sense of identity that can find that dopamine shift. So examples. Visceral overwhelming practice is a means of shifting compulsion. You have desire to eat. In that moment, an example, a shift changer, drawing a hot bath with Epsom salt and immersing yourself in the hot bath, particularly if you have some scented candles or some scent that you really enjoy. That can shift that bubble of identification and pop it, and suddenly you no longer feel the compulsion anymore or a different relationship to it. Feeling a desire to go for, to eat, and if it's a safe environment, going for a vigorous walk for a half an hour. 15 minutes away, 15 minutes back. You know, sometimes, you know, if you have that compulsiveness, and this is what I mean by balancing the inner and the outer world, the compulsiveness is related to the outer world. Even when you have a sense of poor self-esteem, it's related to the outer world. If you can relate to the inner world, you know, doing something that isn't what you want to do, but that you actually do know that you want to do. Cleaning the house. Getting up and cleaning the house for a half an hour when you feel that compulsion. So that's one of the elements that can shift it. Chanting. Chanting is another great way of shifting that compulsiveness, because the compulsiveness is always being trapped in a bubble, and the bubble doesn't give you the sense that you can have anything else. But if the bubble pops, you can see a whole new world. One more question or statement, and then let's do just a little bit more practice, if you wouldn't mind. And by the way, you know, I really appreciate the interaction, because that's where we find genius. I'm not into the cult of personality, not at all. I am not into it. I've seen too many megalomaniacs in my life to want to be on that train, okay? But what we understand is by listening deeply, we access our relationship to genius, which gives us solutions that we never anticipate. And so that's part of what this whole conversation is about. And it relates to that relationship between the feminine and the masculine. It's so important for us to get out of that concept, like we're talking about men and women. We are all feminine and masculine. The listening mind, the deep, deep, deep listening, what it does is it creates the relationship to the observer, which is your access to your intuition. If you're caught up in compulsion, you don't have contact with your intuition, not the positive intuition. You might have contact with sort of dark genius, but that's not working for your good. At least one other person. Does anyone else have any questions or statements before we do just a little bit more practice before I let you go with your magnificent day? Ella, how about yourself? Do you have any statements or questions at all that you want to bring up, or any elements of how you are able to shift it when you find yourself get caught up in a mind state? Okay, that's perfectly okay. Oh, Microphone is not working. Interesting talk. Thank you very much, Ella. Thank you. How about anyone else? Anyone else have anything that they'd like to say or add? Patricia, does anything come to mind for you? Ruben, go ahead.
Question. I'm sorry, this is changing the thing, but you said something very important that I had thought about in the beginning. You had mentioned that it was difficult to be a Buddhist and at the same time look at books like, things like, being open to fortune, being open to advance and things like that. And I was waiting for you to answer that question. How do you solve that seeming contradiction of, not having more desire that brings suffering, and at the same time be open to the abundance of the universe?
I love it. Thank you. So imagine you're looking at an aquarium. And this aquarium, you're observing this aquarium. It's not filled with water. It's filled with something even more special than water. This godlike ambrosia of awareness. Mm-hmm. And this is your field of awareness. Everything that you experience now or has ever experienced is in that field of awareness. Consciousness is like a computer. Consciousness is related to, if you have your computer in the room by itself going, without any awareness there, it's nothing, right? And so so consciousness is a computer, consciousness is a tool, and all elements of that consciousness are a tool, including desire. Tools are wonderful if they're used at the right place in the right time. A hammer is a wonderful tool. It's not that great for cleaning windows. Okay, so the point is using the appropriate tool in the appropriate place. Emotions are wonderful. Emotions are not bad. They are here to give us the gorgeous technicolor experience of life. But if we don't understand emotion, we begin to live for emotion. So desire, it falls into that field. The Buddha said, supposedly the Buddha said, I am told that the Buddha said, that the Buddha was a prince. And he went out into the world for the first time, and he was overwhelmed by the suffering. Death, poverty, disease, and we could go on from there. So the Buddha developed an overwhelming desire to see the cessation of suffering. If you're walking in a forest and you step on a thorn, you can use another thorn to pick out the thorn that's embedded. But once you do, you realize you don't live for the thorn that you picked out the other thorn with. You cast them both aside. If we live for desire, then we want to keep it on simmer. Irritation becomes resentment. Resentment becomes hatred. And what we hate, we fear. So what I'm saying is, if you use your desire to help you connect with what you really value, then desire becomes part of the fulfillment of a healthy life. But if we live for desire and we objectify it, then we need to have it around forever. And that's when it becomes our master rather than our servant. Does that make sense, Ruben?
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough, but yeah, it does.
Yeah, and coming back to that image of looking at the aquarium, our sense of self is also in the aquarium. Me, who I think I am, Drake, is in the aquarium. What's going on in the world is in the aquarium. So the point is that everything you are is in the aquarium. The world exists in you. Your body is in you. And so if we can get to that level of distance, then we're in the listening mind, and that's when we can access genius. And then desire, hey, desire is healthy. It's like making babies is healthy, right? It's only when we objectify it that it becomes an illness. So thank you so much, Ruben. All right. Does anyone have any last question or statement? Okay, now I want to ask you, now this mission, should you choose to accept it? And you can tell that I'm from a child of the 60s because I was listening to that show, Mission Impossible, when I was growing up. And by the way, now I've got the gray hair, so I can really do it like Peter Graves. All right. This mission, should you choose to accept it, is to change your relationship and be aware when you're feeling compulsiveness. It's so overwhelming. And, activate those processes. Write down 10 state changers, 10 ways that can pop the bubble of compulsion. Soothing exercises, calming exercises. When you immerse your body in water, ice cold showers. If you put your feet in the earth and cover your feet with earth. If you garden. This mission, should you choose to accept it, is when you feel the first sprout of compulsiveness, to do something in that moment that can shift the relationship to it. And understand, just like me, part of me didn't want to shift the relationship I had with fear because I thought it was keeping me safe. But it was keeping me trapped. It just introduced me to a lot more people to be afraid of. So when I'm asking you to realize that part of what happened for me is I began to have this belief structure. I began to condition myself to believe that if I learned to change my relationship to fear, that I would become useful and helpful to others. Your life is happening for you, not to you, including the compulsion. It's there so you can recognize your relationship to self-mastery. Because if you're the master of yourself, then the compulsion is no longer there, or at least it changes its relationship. And the beauty is it doesn't just change it now, but it changes your relationship to your past. So I want to do one last practice as a closing. So if you would, remember that when you travel, if you go to France, for instance, you can't carry your baggage with you everywhere. Even if you value your baggage, you have to put it down sometimes. You're only going to wear yourself out and step through existential fatigue into existential exhaustion. So sitting up tall, just taking a moment, even in a minor way, to release. So I'm going to ask you to be aware that one of the major areas that you hold your life is in your jaws. Just be aware of your jaws. Sitting up tall, you can have your eyes either closed or open. Slow your breathing down. Drop awareness into intention. I'm asking you to be aware of what you truly value. If you are aware of what you truly value, you can release compulsion. Slowing the breathing down. Stepping into intention. As you exhale, you want to be in contact with your authentic self. Your authentic self is not missing anything. Slow the breathing down and begin to relax your jaws. Slow breaths in and out. And as you begin to intend that relaxation of your jaws, you're probably going to be aware that your jaws feel fatigued. They feel tight. You've been clenching your jaws. Don't lose the breath. Slow breaths in and out. And after the next inhalation, I'm going to ask you to take a large, magnificent yawn. So let's breathe in. And a magnificent yawn. Maybe I'm going to get my body into... Chest is up. Exhale, let go. Jaws relaxing. When you yawn, that's an invitation for your jaws to release. Relax the jaws and feel how it changes your relationship to your face. Breathing slowly and easily. When your jaws relax, it gives you the opportunity to let your lips be soft. Breathing nice and easily. When your jaws relax, it takes strain off of the eyes. Let the eyes relax. And the brow point right between the eyebrows, let that release. Jaws releasing, relax the center of the forehead. It's almost imperceptible, but when your jaws release, your scalp becomes more loose. It's amazing. Relaxing the jaws changes the relationship to the neck. When your jaws relax, it gives the neck permission to be a little bit more relaxed. The shoulders have permission to drop. When your jaws relax, it actually is an invitation for the heart to open. And you can't be aware of the beauty of the world without an open heart. Breathing slowly and easily. Clenched fists tend to come with clenched jaws. Relax the jaws and the hands. Breathing slowly and easily. Just feel that openness. When we are in flow, we find that the flow is part of our support in the world. The negativity that I am holding on to, the shame, the guilt, the judgment. This thought I do not want. I choose instead peace. I'm going to ring the bell. I'm going to ask you to listen carefully. Here we go. Now, from my background, I bring my hands into prayer position and I bow to you for wherever you are because our hearts are connected. This thought I do not want, I choose instead transformation. Namaste. Thank you for your time. I hope this has been of value. Thank you so much.